The Christmas Truce of 1914, although its effects were not widespread or long-lasting, was an important moment in history that revealed aspects of human nature and demonstrated the power of the universality of the human experience. The unofficial truce and the exchange of gifts, words, and stories between soldiers in the trenches changed opinions of the enemy on both sides and demonstrated the futility of the nation's conflict. The encounter between enemy soldiers in World War I was an event that was never again seen on quite the same scale in war.
World War I started on July 29, 1914, with a shelling of the Balkan country of Serbia by their neighbor Austria-Hungary. Before the attack, tensions of militarism, nationalism, and imperialism had been growing. People had greater pride and loyalty to their independent countries than ever, especially in the Balkan regions, which had recently gained independence from the Ottomans and had formed various nationalist groups. Countries were building up their militaries. Germany and Great Britain were in an arms race to build bigger and better ships and stores of weapons. As countries grew economically and politically, they took over foreign colonies to supply themselves with raw materials. There was a scramble to obtain land in the valuable continent of Africa. These conflicts led up to the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, was pushed by Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany to attack Serbia in response. Country after country was pulled into the conflict due to many complicated and overlapping alliances. France and Britain, along with Belgium and Russia, came to the aid of Serbia against the joined forces of Austria-Hungary and Germany. It was commonly believed that the war would be over by Christmas time. The men were eager to join and prove their patriotism. One German soldier, Walter Limmer, wrote to his family just before boarding a train bound for the front lines of battle. "Be proud that you live in such times and in such a nation, and that you have the privilege of sending several of those you love into this glorious struggle." Unbeknownst to the men, the war would stretch on for nearly 4 years, and was to be the most brutal in history up to that point. Trench warfare was introduced in World War I. Unlike in wars past, where battles were typically fought on an open plain, the war was fought in ditches and dugouts in the ground, with perpetual shelling from enemy mortars. Rations of food were scarce, and the soldiers lived in constant filth and fear of the enemy, whose own trenches were only meters away. The soldiers were soon robbed of their patriotic fervor.
Pope Benedict made efforts to arrange a formal truce for that Christmas of 1914 between the warring countries. However, Russia declined, and therefore no truce was to take place. There was little action on the Western Front that December. Troops weren't firing during mealtimes and were sending newspapers across no man's land. British volunteers had no emotional reasons to fight the Germans, and the elite Prussian troops had recently been replaced by undertrained German volunteers, many of whom had lived or worked in Britain before the war. Commanders of both sides were worried about the possibility of friendliness between the troops. As Christmas approached, both sides were preparing for the holiday. Soldiers received gift packages made by civilians back home containing cigars, chocolates, and other small gifts. British soldiers were purposely sent extra to encourage sharing amongst themselves. Small Christmas trees were distributed to all of the German trenches. Despite the efforts of commanders on both sides, something miraculous happened that Christmas Eve and Christmas morning. Across the Western Front, unofficial truces began to occur. On Christmas Eve, in many areas on the Flanders Front and in other areas, singing was heard in the opposite trenches. The Germans sang, and the English soldiers followed with their own Christmas carols. An officer, British Private Albert Morin, said that around 7 or 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve, the British could hear the Germans singing Stille, Nacht and saw lights across the trenches. Those lights were German Christmas trees. One young German lieutenant wrote about these trees and how he posted a small Christmas tree in his dugout and a second lighted tree on the breastwork. In one British soldier's letter home, he wrote that they shouted friendly greetings across no man's land, and the Germans shouted back, "Don't shoot until New Year's Day." An officer from the Queen's Westminster Rifles wrote that the next day would have made a good chapter in Dickens' Christmas Carol. The men left the trenches on the foggy Christmas morning and walked across, exchanging small gifts, including some of the extras from their gift packages sent by those back at home. The officer said that they talked with 3 or 4 of the Germans, and he called them awfully decent fellows and intelligent, respectable-looking men. A major in the Leicestershire regiment said that they exchanged cigars and called the Germans jolly, cheery fellows for the most part, and it seemed so silly under the circumstances to be fighting them. In several other accounts, more soldiers crossed the before dreaded no man's land and spoke with the enemy in small groups. Phil Rader, an American serving in the French Foreign Legion at the time of the truce, wrote, "There was Christmas light in our eyes, and I know there were Christmas tears in mine." The officers shook hands in no man's land, and a truce was arranged to bury the dead.
However, the positive, happy reaction to the truce was not shared by all the soldiers. Eugene Jacobs, an American soldier in the truce, was known by his comrades as a German hater. A soldier he worked with wrote home that all day Christmas he sulked, while the others were enjoying the Christmas truce. Another individual, the young German corporal Adolf Hitler, chose not to participate in the truce. When his fellow soldiers suggested that they join in, Hitler responded, "Such a thing should never happen in wartime. Have you no German sense of honor left at all?"
Some soldiers chose not to participate out of fear rather than hatred. The British General Walter Congreve described the truce in a letter to his wife, but stated that he himself did not leave the trenches, afraid that the Germans would not be able to resist shooting a general. The truce often did not last long. Congreve wrote that one of his men described meeting the best shot in the German army, and took note of where he was in hopes of downing him the next day. There were both positive and negative responses to the truce. The New York Tribune said that the truce's spirit should be a lesson and example to the bitter haters back home in either country. Conversely, the high commanders of the British and the Germans were unhappy when they heard about the truce. General Horace Lockwood Smith Dorrien sent a message to his commanders reminding them of the strict orders against fraternization, and asked for the names of the officers and units who participated, so that they could be disciplined. In many areas, units that participated were sent to new areas of the battlefield to break up any friendships that had formed. However, in some areas, truces continued nearly until spring. In an area called Ploegstert Wood, the British and German troops had become friends and would warn each other when their general was coming for inspection, and they would resume shooting. However, by Easter, all truces were over and heavy fighting resumed. There were 3 more years of war. Franz Joseph died in 1916, and control of Austria-Hungary fell to Charles I, who sought peace in October 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm was facing unrest in the military and civilians. He abdicated the throne in November, and Germany sued for peace. The Great War ended on November 11, 1918, leaving over 8 million soldiers and 5 million civilians dead. Survivors were devastated by physical and emotional wounds. Farms, factories, and homes were destroyed.
The Christmas Truce of 1914 was a significant event in the history of the war and of the world. It demonstrates the lack of soldiers' personal involvement and investment in the war. The participants' mindset towards the enemy was shifted in a way that no other encounter could have brought about. British Private Albert Morin said, "If the truce had gone on and on, there's no telling what could have happened. It could have meant the end of the war." Germans, British, French, and other nationalities were brought together by their mutual feelings towards the war and their celebration of Christmas, a universal day of peace and goodwill. Although the soldiers exchanged gifts, drinks, and addresses, there was more to the Christmas truce than that. They exchanged culture and traditions and the hope that mankind is more than killing each other. They exchanged the common bond that they had been dragged into a war they didn't necessarily support or connect to personally. Together they defied the strict commands of their superiors and proved the idea that even in the midst of a struggle so vile and barbaric, people could still recognize the humanity in their enemies' eyes.